Hello, and welcome to Herantis Pharma's corporate presentation for May 2022. This is Julie Silber, Investor Relations for Herantis. I will be the moderator for today's call. Please note that this call is being recorded, and for the duration of your call, the lines will be in listen-only mode. Presenting today is Interim CEO Frans Witte, after which CSO Henri Huhtinen and COO Antti Vuolanto will join the call for the Q&A portion. You can type your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard. Questions will be taken in the order they are received, and I want to remind you that management can only answer questions that pertain to today's presentation. Additionally, during today's webinar, management may make forward-looking statements that involve known and unknown risks, certainties, and other important factors beyond the company's control that could cause the company's actual results, performance, or achievements to be materially different from the expected results, performance, or achievements expressed or implied by such forward-looking statements. These statements are subject to risks and uncertainties that could cause actual results to differ materially from those contained in the forward-looking statements. Actual results and the timing of certain events may differ materially from the results or timing predicted or implied by such forward-looking statements, and reported results should not be considered as an indication of future performance. Please note that these forward-looking statements made during this webinar speak only as of today's date, and the company undertakes no obligation to update them to reflect subsequent events or circumstances other to the extent required by law. As you know, the company is currently undertaking a rights offering, and therefore there are important instructions that I will now highlight. Of special note, the information contained herein is not for publication or distribution directly or indirectly in or into Australia, Canada, Hong Kong, Japan, Singapore, South Africa, or the United States, or in any other jurisdiction in which publication or distribution would be unlawful. The rights offering consists of a public offering in Finland and Sweden, private placements in the European Economic Area, the EEA, other than in Finland and Sweden, and private placements in certain other jurisdictions outside the United States subject to applicable law. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available shortly after this call on Herantis Pharma's website under the header Investor Relations and the subheader Rights Offering 2022. Now, with these formalities out of the way, I would like to turn the call over to our interim CEO, Frans Witte. Frans, you may begin.
Thank you for the introduction, Julie. Happy to be with you and welcome to this webinar also on my and the company's behalf. So let's just a quick glance, summary of Herantis in a nutshell. So Herantis has a lead asset called HER96, which is a small peptidomimetic molecule with a unique mechanism of action that can be administered subcutaneously. And we have a team of dedicated employees, 14 employees, and a board of directors with relevant industry experience. And in addition, we're supported by a scientific advisory board of industry and academic leaders. And Herantis is listed on both Finnish and Swedish First North Nasdaq. Next slide, please. Let's dive a bit deeper into Parkinson's disease. So Parkinson's disease is the second most common neurodegenerative disease, and there are approximately 8 million patients today suffering from it globally. This figure is expected to grow to roughly 12 million by 2040. And while its cause is still unknown, its symptoms are caused by degeneration and death of dopamine neurons in the brain. It's estimated that at time of diagnosis, already half of the dopamine neurons have died and hardly any are left after 10 years. Today's therapies are mainly dopamine replacement agents that unfortunately do not delay the disease progress, but only treat its symptoms. And to answer to this need, Herantis has now developed HER96 as a novel therapy that aims to delay the progress of the disease. Let's move on to the next slide, please. So the disease causes a chronic cellular stress. The Parkinson's disease causes a chronic cellular stress in the brain that dysregulates the protein metabolism and leads to a toxic aggregation of proteins like alpha-synuclein. And the subsequent cell degeneration and death caused by the accumulation of these aggregates in the cells leads to an inflammation of the surrounding nerve tissue that in turn increases the cellular stress and enhances this vicious circle. And like CDNF, HER96 has been shown to possess a unique and broad mechanism of action that counteracts these processes and aims to restore the proteostasis in the cell. This indicates clearly that it could delay the progress of Parkinson's disease. Next slide, please. So while we obtained promising results from our studies with CDNF, we faced a significant hurdle in its development. It doesn't easily penetrate the blood-brain barrier and therefore needed to be administered directly into the brain to be effective. This way of administration is cumbersome and would limit the number of patients benefiting from the therapy. And further to this, as an answer, we have now managed to develop HER96 that has been purposefully designed to reach the brain upon subcutaneous administration. It is a small peptidomimetic molecule designed according to the active site of the CDNF protein. It has the same powerful biological activity as CDNF does. An additional advantage is that it can be manufactured synthetically and very cost effective. Next slide, please. We have to remember that for drugs that treat disorders of the central nervous system, it is essential that therapeutically relevant doses can reach the brain. However, 98% of small molecule drugs and almost 100% of large molecule drugs do not pass the blood-brain barrier. You can imagine that, therefore, we were very pleased to see that HER96 could pass the blood-brain barrier in studies with animals, rodents, and recently also in dogs. Next slide, please. And some words about where we come from and our history and the R&D that we have conducted so far. So we would not be here and we would not have been able to develop HER96 without our extensive preclinical and clinical R&D work on CDNF in the past. This has allowed us to generate a library of CDNF peptidomimetics and significantly facilitate and de-risk the development of HER96. And we now, therefore, can also focus solely on the development of these peptidomimetics further due to their important advantages, such as named earlier, convenient administration and efficient manufacturing. Next slide, please. And here are some data confirming the unique mechanism of action of HER96 in an industry standard mouse model of Parkinson's disease. And in this model on the left-hand side, you can see that it gives a clear improvement in dopamine neuron survival compared to control animals. And secondly, it decreased the formation of these toxic alpha-synuclein aggregates compared to placebo. And last but not least, it also significantly reduced the neuroinflammation of the tissues. On the right-hand side, importantly, you could see that we have demonstrated that an adequate concentration of HER96 reaches the brain after a single administration, subcutaneous administration in animals. Let's go on from here. Next slide, please. And the next development milestones that we have in front of us ahead of us for HER96 are the submission of a CTA by the end of this year. So that's a clinical trial application, and phase 1 study demonstrating safety and penetration of the blood-brain barrier after subcutaneous administration in humans as well. And that's going to happen next year if everything goes well. Next slide, please. All in all, I think Herantis is a very interesting investment proposition because first of all, we have a potentially a blockbuster therapy in development for Parkinson's disease with a unique disease-modifying mechanism of action. And at the same time, there's a big unmet need for better and disease-modifying therapies. And we have compelling evidence of HER96's ability to rescue dopamine neurons, and we have shown that it penetrates the blood-brain barrier following subcutaneous administration in animals. And finally, we aim to reach an important milestone next year by demonstrating that HER96 is safe and can penetrate the blood-brain barrier after subcutaneous administration, also in humans. And I'd like to remind you that we have recently seen partnering deals that have been signed at the end of the preclinical and early clinical phase of development in neurodegenerative diseases, including Parkinson's disease. And therefore, we believe that achieving the first clinical milestone next year would create significant value to Herantis and its shareholders and open new partnering prospects to us. Next slide, please. Just to show some of the people behind Herantis here, and this is our committed management team. And on the right-hand side, you can see our board of directors. And next slide, please. Together, we have a very broad and complementary skill set and experience from several companies within the industry. As you can see, next slide, please. And we're particularly happy that we're supported by world-leading experts in Parkinson's disease from both the industry and academia. I think my formal update on the company presentation ends here, but I'd like to still say a few words about the offering in brief. Can you take the next slide, please, Jenny? So the offering in brief is that here's a snapshot. So we seek gross proceeds of 7.25 million euro. The subscription price has been set at 150 in euros or Swedish crowns 1560. And the subscription period actually started already. It started on May the 10th, and it will last until next week, May 24th in Sweden and May 27th in Finland. And there is, of course, a secondary subscription opportunity if not all shares are subscribed for in the primary subscription. And you can get more information on this from our Herantis website. Next slide, please. Here are some important dates that I'm not going to go through now, but I believe that they will be part of the presentation on the website afterwards. Next slide, please. I would like to still point out that there are risks related to an investment in a company like Herantis, and they're summed up here. I'm not going to repeat them, but you can do so separately after the meeting, after the webinar, if you so like. I think we are, the next slide, please, has some more of these risk factors. So as you can see, we've been pretty exhaustive here just to be fair and also complete in exposing these. If you wish to contact any of us, please do so. There's some contact details here. You can also contact our bank, United Bankers, should there be a need. Thank you. I think I turn this back to you, Julie, for questions and answers.
Great, thank you, Franz. We will now start the Q&A portion of the call. As a reminder, you can type your questions in the Q&A section of the webinar dashboard. Questions will be taken in the order they are received, and management can only answer questions that pertain to today's presentation. Our first question is, can you give some color on what the competitive market looks like for Herantis?
Yeah, sure, my pleasure. I think that's so the Parkinson's disease market is large, and it's estimated to reach 11.5 billion in 2029. And there's a significant unmet medical need for better and disease-modifying therapies like HER96. Since, as we talked about, current therapies are mostly dopamine replacement agents that only treat the symptoms of the disease. In addition, the current therapies also often cause side effects, and their efficacy diminishes over time. Then if we look at the therapies, other therapies in development for Parkinson's disease, we're pleased that HER96 targets several key pathologies underlying Parkinson's disease. And it is our belief that a broader mechanism of action or a broad mechanism of action increases the probability of success for HER96 becoming an effective therapy. And I think that the novel therapies like HER96 that aim to delay or stop the progression of the disease could increase the size of the total market and take a significant share of it. Back to you.
Great, thanks. There's a brief follow-up to this. Would you say that Herantis's competitive advantage is the mechanism of action and the novelness of the compound?
I think that's absolutely true. But secondly, it's also important to demonstrate that it can be conveniently administered, like in a subcutaneous administration route would be a good example of that. And that it still is able to do what it needs to do and affect the brain where it needs to affect the brain. So I think those combined would be quite compelling points for HER96 going forward.
Great, thanks. The next question is, you mentioned a little bit about various projects getting partnering opportunities after their phase 1. Can you talk a little bit more on how this might be an opportunity for Herantis?
Well, as we've seen in the last 2 years in particular, there's been several partnering transactions with Parkinson's disease therapies in development. And typically they take place at the end of the preclinical stage or just in the beginning of the phase 1 or the clinical stage. And since we are going to approach that phase in development soon, we believe that if we're successful in reaching that milestone, we are well positioned for partnering discussion.
Sounds good. I'm just going to remind everyone, if they want to ask a question, to type it into the webinar dashboard under questions. We have another question came in. Can you provide more clarity around the recent HER96 data from dogs that was announced and what it means to be pharmacologically active level?
Can I, sure, can I refer this question to Henry, our CSO?
Sure.
Hello, thanks, Franz. I'm glad to take this one. And thank you for the question. As we have told previously, we started the preclinical program of HER96 by studying the compound in small animals, rodents like mice and rats, where we first studied its distribution and metabolism, etc. Also did some studies in disease models studying its therapeutic effects. However, since there are some physiological differences between animal species, it's important that we also extend these studies to larger animals. And also, for example, dogs are often used in toxicology studies preclinically. So logical next step for us was to extend these studies to beagle dogs. And recently, a couple of weeks ago, we released we announced that we have now got first data from dogs in the pharmacokinetic distribution study, where we do see after single subcutaneous bolus injection the compound reaching the cerebrospinal fluid similarly as we see in mice and rats. And this is of course very encouraging and shows that the pharmacokinetic profile of the compound in larger animals is very similar to what we see in smaller animals, and this provides a nice stepping stone forward towards the first in human studies. And in this dog study, similar to the rodent studies, we did see that the concentrations in the cerebrospinal fluid were in the pharmacologically active level, which means that we are expecting then this administration route and these type of dose levels to result in therapeutic effects in larger animals as well.
Great, thanks, Henry. We don't have any questions in queue at this moment. I'll make one last appeal for questions, and maybe I'll turn it back to you, Franz, for a little bit of closing, and then I'll give some instructions on where they can find this on the website.
Sure, happy to do so. So I just would like to conclude by saying that thanks to the confidence of our investors And as a result of our extensive R&D on CDNF, we've been able to rapidly develop now HER96. And that's truly an interesting potential disease-modifying therapy for Parkinson's disease, which is a big unmet medical need today. And with these proceeds of the current offering, we aim to reach this important milestone next year and believe that it would open good partnering prospects to us and to HER96 to be taken forward. And I'd like to thank you for at least a few good questions and joining our webinar today. So thank you on my behalf.
And thank you too. I just want to remind everyone that this will be available on our website under Investor Relations and Rights Offering 2022 on our website. This concludes today's call. Thank you very much for joining.